This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to the podcast of Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks book talk series. In today's talk, originally presented at Mann Library on March 2nd, 2010, Anna Flaming, the recipient of the 2009 College of Human Ecology Fellowship in the History of Home Economics, describes how Home Economist proposed a positive and diverse definition of the American homemaker.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the committee for awarding me the 2009 fellowship. The time and the funding made it possible for me to look at manuscript collections that allowed me to question my assumptions and hone my thinking about the ways that Americans have perceived homemaking and home economics, and the ways that home economics continually redefined the role of the homemaker. I'm especially grateful to Jeff Sobol and Jan Jennings, who welcomed me to Cornell during my 6 weeks here this summer. All researchers are indebted to the important work of archivists, and Elaine Ingst, Eileen Keating, and Sarah Keene are paragons of their profession. Their insights and suggestions led me to materials I might not have discovered otherwise, and the entire staff in the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections were friendly and helpful, and they made my time at Cornell especially productive. In early January, an advertisement for the new 1963 Cadillac began appearing in publications ranging from the Wall Street Journal to the Daily Oklahoman. The ad depicted a man looking on approvingly as his blonde, well-dressed wife admired the new car parked in the driveway of their large home. Under the headline, "How to Please Your Home Economist," the ad copy promised that although any lady would find Cadillac to be, quote, a gallant and considerate escort wherever she goes, it was to her practical side that this new 1963 Cadillac made its deepest appeal. The ad promised that any man's home economist would surely be impressed by the car's soundness as an investment. Letters poured into the American Home Economics Association, alerting AHEA leaders of the advertisement's troubling conflation of the terms home economist and homemaker. Joan Gaines, AHEA Public Relations Director, wrote a letter protesting the misuse of the title home economist. Her message elicited a response from the account supervisor of the Cadillac advertisement. His letter explained that, despite her concerns, he could find no technical error in going over the headline and copy. Furthermore, he assured her that the writer of the offending headline was actually quite familiar with home economics, since his own wife was a little home ec major who had met the true test of her academic preparation as a housewife. He concluded the unapologetic letter by inviting Mr. Gaines to visit your local authorized Cadillac dealer that he might buy one for his home economist. In fact, the advertising community as a whole was unmoved by the AHEA's objections. An editorial in the Advertising and Marketing magazine Printers, Inc. remarked that the AHEA should stop, quote, pushing the panic button and relax and enjoy it. This episode suggests a lot about the ways that home economists struggled to define and explain home economics, as well as the ways that the image of the homemaker was linked to the profession's struggle for respect. In the next 40 minutes or so, I will explain some of the ways in which the homemaker and the home economist became connected in the public imagination. I'll describe some of the tactics that home economists used to reshape their own image, as well as that of the homemaker, in order to promote respect for home economics and its practitioners. The history of these attempts suggests how deeply embedded gender was in the ways that American culture understood the homemaker and the home economist. One of the most important reasons that the home economist and the homemaker became confused was because many Americans only encountered home economics in the secondary schools, where home economics curriculum was called homemaking, and where, after 1944, coursework was integrated with participation in the organization Future Homemakers of America, or FHA. Although disparate local and state groups had existed earlier, the founding of the FHA organized them and provided a national program of work for students who were or had been enrolled in high school homemaking classes, although African American chapters in the segregated South had to join the separate New Homemakers of America, or NHA, an arrangement considered not ideal. FHA activities in the 1940s and 1950s were planned to prepare students for adulthood. An FHA chapter in Topeka, Kansas celebrated a program called Easy Evening for Mother, in which each of the members took over the job of planning, preparing, and serving one meal, as well as planning for after-dinner entertainment. Future homemakers learned to interact comfortably with boys by hosting a sweetheart ball or spinster's spin. FHA leaders reported what they saw as positive changes in their female students. One student, Betty, had joined purely because the dance club was filled, had developed an appreciation of neat clothes, soft voices, and attractive surrounding that grew throughout the winter, and FHA had helped Betty start toward successful womanhood. But the FHA defined training for homemaking and for successful womanhood a little bit more broadly than sweetheart balls and dinner planning might suggest. FHA's emblem, used on everything from paperwork to jewelry, depicted a house held in two hands, meant to denote that the homes of tomorrow are in the hands of future homemakers. Rays surrounding the home signified the influence of the community on the home, and more importantly, the importance of the home in the community. Thus, from the beginning, the organization was envisioned as a means of counteracting notions of home economics and homemaking that were restricted to cooking and sewing. The first plan of action of the National Future Homemakers of America seemed to define the homemaker in ungendered terms. Under the motto, Future Homemakers of America, Build for Tomorrow, students were encouraged to cultivate tolerance and leadership abilities, and not surprisingly in the period, work to restore peace. FHA, then, was a training ground for life as productive citizens. Experience in community activities and democratic problem solving would benefit future homemakers as community leaders and allow them to learn the real meaning of democracy, quote, in homes and in our country. Future homemakers learned more about their future roles from a chapter mother, chosen especially for her reputation as a civic-minded person. Some groups had a chapter dad. Despite the prevalence of the female pronoun in FHA documents, males were always technically welcome in FHA. Though FHA students at the organization's second national convention in Kansas City had to attend mixers dressed as both girls and boys, the state of Oklahoma did send 3 male members. In fact, by 1952, a male chapter president was attempting to correct gendered stereotypes about homemakers and home economics in general. The linkage of the Home Economist and the Homemaker was also due to AHEA's marketing of college-level home economics as training for, quote, a double future that included both homemaking and a career. Home economics education, it claimed, could never be wasted. A 1959 radio script explained, quote, if she should go immediately from home economics into marriage, she's a natural for homemaking, able to stretch her husband's dollars through good home management, a whiz at child care who knows what puts the roses in those infant cheeks, and able to decorate a prettier home through understanding colors in home decoration. It promised that jobs would be waiting if she decided to work after her children were grown because, unlike most professions, taking time off for raising a family would only improve her skills. Because of this unique ability to accommodate women's multiple roles, home economics was regarded as the most sellable of all professions for women, or even the perfect job. In fact, many women did choose home economics for that reason. AHEA's Home Economics and Homemaking Group, or HEIH, first formed in 1924 to provide professional engagement for its members. At its peak, it included 11% of the total AHEA membership, and of course many homemakers never joined AHEA. Throughout its history, HEIH were also encouraged to use their unique position to evangelize the importance of homemaking among non-home economists and to provide, quote, a built-in testing laboratory for the American Home Economics Association, fully staffed by trained technicians in every and all fields connected with home economics. So while the AHEA recognized that a woman could be both a homemaker and a home economist, it was deeply troubled that these two identities had become so blurred. The confusing Cadillac ad and the unsympathetic response of its creators were symptomatic of a widespread problem. Frustrated home economists who felt that their $20 annual membership dues entitled them to protection of their hard-earned professional title sent in example after example of the ways in which the home economist was being confused with the homemaker. There were reports from Nebraska of companies employing homemakers to pass out samples at grocery stores and give consumers advice as though they were trained home economists. The Farm Bureau News explained that any housewife was a home economist. When the AHEA complained, the editor produced what must have been an especially unsatisfying answer, merely explaining that he knew many home economists and, quote, they all seemed to be very nice people. A syndicated columnist defined home economist as the title that describes modern housewives and homemakers best. After some cajoling, though, she did write a retraction that acknowledged that even the greatest homemaker in the world was not necessarily a home economist, and a home economist might well be a career girl with a 5-figure salary who is anything but the domestic type. More troubling was evidence that these misperceptions thrived even among the co-workers of home economists. A 1961 image study of 660 people who worked with but were not themselves home economists found extensive confusion. One participant understood home economics as, quote, teaching the best way to be a homemaker and to be a good housewife. and another as, quote, the ladies work in the home, cooking, washing, mending, childcare, and general household work. Though not the first of its kind, the survey inspired a 10-day conference where 26 leading home economists deliberated on the ideal image of the discipline. Their discussion resulted in a survey of visual aids produced by home economists to promote or explain the profession. To help with the evaluation of the visual aids, the AHEA brought in a male consultant with expertise in visual aids, but who claimed to have no previous knowledge of home economics. Among his major criticisms of the visual aids in circulation at that time was, quote, the overlapping, the blending, and the blurring of the homemaker and the home economist. So these are visual aids from and by home economists that are having this problem. Additionally, use of the phrase professional homemaker proved to be problematic. Even AHEA staff members were unable to say for certain whether a professional homemaker was a woman engaged full-time in taking care of her home, or whether it suggested some level of home economics training. The results of the survey were so compelling that they became the basis of a program created for the 53rd annual meeting in 1962, and then mass-produced and sold for $10 apiece. I looked it up on an inflation calculator that suggested this would be about $70 in 2009. The fact that 88 copies had been sold to groups in 37 different states before the end of the year suggests the breadth of concern among home economists. The problem was causing real distress within the AHEA, and it was becoming clear that piecemeal responses to individual infractions were not effective. In June of 1962, the AHEA Executive Board delegated the task of creating a definition of the home economist to the Public Relations and Communications Committee. The committee agreed that a woman does not become a home economist by virtue of being a housewife and a homemaker. But what, the committee wondered, of a homemaker who had home economics training but who had never been employed as a home economist, or of a home economist who left the profession after a few years? In the end, the baffled subcommittee reported that the task was, quote, impossible. The committee did release a statement in January of 1963 explaining that the homemaker or housewife was definitely not the same as a home economist. But the organization opted to only use the release internally, fearing that national media would make light of, quote, what we consider to be a very serious professional issue. The reaction of the advertising community to their complaints about the Cadillac ad demonstrates that they were probably right. But what's interesting here, though, is that the issue was confusing enough to members in the profession that an internal press release was deemed necessary. And in fact, responses to the press release were mixed. Some objected that the statement undermined the authority of those trained in home economists who had chosen to devote themselves to unwaged homemaking. So the AHEA called upon the home economists and homemaking membership to help preserve, quote, professional esteem and professional status by explaining the distinction to the public. But by 1965, the Public Relations Advisory Committee was still protesting that home economist and homemaker are interchangeable in the minds of the general public. In particular, they feared that the conflation of home economist with homemaker diminished home economics as a profession. At the annual meeting in Atlantic City, members debated a proposed definition that included a complicated algorithm involving length of employment, home economics degrees attained, and hours of home economics coursework completed. It also suggested a new title, Associate Home Economist, for those who had not yet achieved the employment requirements. Though the definition was not meant to be enforceable or even to affect membership status in AHEA, it met with its share of criticism. Created to delineate the difference between home economist and homemaker, the definition's employment requirements had stripped homemakers with home economics degrees of their professional titles if they had spent less than 3 years in the waged workforce. This must have been particularly troubling given the fact that many of these women had been recruited to home economics under the double future motto that told them homemaking was a home economics career. The new definition also posed other problems. A faculty member at the University of Wisconsin School of Home Economics, who had taught for more than 25 years but whose training was in a related field, found herself left out. Another critic pointed out that Ellen Richards, the first president of the AHEA, would not qualify under this definition. Meanwhile, the number of men opting to major in home economics was rising, and an AHEA survey questioned whether these men would be called home economists, given the female connotation of that title. Department heads, for their part, affirmed that while these men might technically qualify as home economists, most would opt for some other title. Thus, even as the AHEA worked to reject gendered assumptions that confused homemakers with trained economists, some were willing to accept a gendered definition of home economist that made the title unsuitable for male practitioners. The home economists needed to defend their profession as separate from housewifery. Promoting respect for the career of homemaking was an important component of their mission. The linked fortunes of Homemaker and Home Economist were described succinctly in a 1958 outline of objectives for AHEA public relations. Quote, "The comparative lack of respect with which homemaking is regarded in our culture is a threat to the future standards of American life. Nevertheless, it argued that the home economist, as the scientist of the home, merits recognition as much as the scientist of the laboratory or the slide rule." A 1955 publication titled Homemaker VIP defined a homemaker as someone who performed dozens of jobs. This work, it argued, was obviously important, but monotonous tasks and the lack of a real honest-to-goodness paycheck could leave a homemaker feeling like just a housewife. The pamphlet's author promoted a changed attitude as the secret to transforming a harried housewife into a very important person. But other home economists made more explicit criticisms of the ways in which housewifery went unrewarded in American society. Home economists involved in the rehabilitation of homemakers with disabilities frequently remarked on the troubling fact that a homemaker, unlike a typist, didn't receive medical benefits through her job. One home economist explained, "Although we're inclined in America to be sentimental about home and mother, we give little prestige to homemaking as a vocation." Home economists' work in the growing field of homemaking rehabilitation also focused on the ways in which efficient homemaking could provide confidence and independence. Though some home economists promoted homemaking rehabilitation for men, including husbands, unmarried veterans, young bachelors, and even young children, home economists most often praised homemaking as a therapy for women. A home economist in California reported that her work with mentally ill patients helped them to, quote, "realize they didn't have to be just a shell wrapped up in their sickness, but they could be most of all a very feminine being with the same joys and interests of millions of other women." But the AHEA was well aware of contemporary critiques of domesticity. Members who attended the 54th annual meeting in June of 1963 heard a talk by a best-selling author named Betty Friedan. Friedan, whose book The Feminist Mystique famously defined the problem that had no name among American housewives, accused home economists of being, quote, "slightly schizophrenic because they gave, quote, lip service to an image and to a mystique that their own lives denied." The audience responded to her criticism with a mixture of silence and good-natured laughter, and at the end applause. Friedan, for her part, declared that, quote, "not on your life did she wish for home economics to disappear. Rather, she challenged home economists to help women to balance marriage and motherhood with outside work, and that to do so would make home economics something new, a major profession, not a minor one. Likely the assembled audience agreed with her. More than a year before Friedan spoke, a writer in the Journal of Home Economics had noted that the new housewife-mother career role was becoming a popular research topic. In 1964, the AHEA urged even more research because college-educated women who rejected, quote, "any self-image for her future beyond that of the full-time wife, mother, and homemaker were in flight from complexity." Other AHEA members were busy spearheading a popular nationwide program called Home Shortcuts for the Working Woman that reportedly compelled full-time homemakers to consider taking on waged work outside the home. Similar discussions were taking place concerning the education of homemaking students. In a speech at the 52nd Annual AHEA meeting in Cleveland, 2 years before Friedan's talk, a Nevada professor of home economics criticized secondary teachers for encouraging pupils to look, quote, "through rose-colored glasses at the home life led by our grandmothers, instead of preparing female students to combine a career with homemaking." That these criticisms were all made at all suggests that Friedan might have been right to worry about sex-directed education, but that they were made by home economists suggests that the discipline was attempting to regulate itself. This issue was especially important as membership in the Future Homemakers of America reached its height in the mid-1960s. A 1967 survey of national meeting delegates found that nearly all future homemakers planned to marry, probably between the ages of 20 and 23, and the respondents hoped for an average of 3.7 children each. But only 29% of these respondents planned to be full-time homemakers. Nevertheless, future homemakers seemed to have understood homemaking as their most important calling. At the 1967 meeting, FHA members participating in a session on women's work worried about the trend for married women to enter the workforce. They feared that it would result in decreased involvement in civic organizations and argued that a woman shouldn't neglect her family in order to hold a job. 2 years later, the FHA Program of Action attempted to provide balance. It proposed efforts to prepare its members for marriage, but also the single vocation. Suggested programs included writing, quote, "a paper on the joys and satisfactions of motherhood and homemaking," and inviting a panel of boys to tell what homemaking qualities they would look for in a wife. But It also advocated inviting a family man to talk about his homemaking role and asking graduating seniors to discuss how they see themselves as homemakers, whether they married or not. By the end of the 1960s, government funding legislation and the recognition of significant changes in women's working patterns required that students encounter both education for unwaged homemaking and education for career preparation. In 1971, a second organization, Home Economics Related Occupations, or HERO, joined FHA in preparing men and women to fill multiple roles as homemakers in the community and in the labor force. But while FHA emphasized homemaking, HERO emphasized waged work. In its first 3 years, over 26,000 students had joined 993 HERO chapters formed in 41 states. Because the two groups shared national meetings, an emblem, and an organizational magazine, the Teen Times, the career training component of homemaking became an important part of FHA as well. FHA also continued to define homemaking in terms of community involvement. Annual meetings included themes like citizenship, FHA's Challenge to Cherish, where students learned about the importance of family and nurturing citizenship. The FHA 1969 Plan of Action suggested that students could conduct sit-ins to talk with elderly people living in retirement homes. A 1971 publication suggested that chapters screen films on communism and then have discussions on its effects and its comparisons with democracy. But despite this breadth of activities, many home economists found that they spent as much time explaining what they did not do as explaining what they did. Publicity accounts repeatedly began with assurances that home economics majors were not women, quote, coasting through school, cooking, sewing, and learning basically to be a good wife and mother. One exasperated speaker at the 1966 annual meeting condemned brainwashed home economists who she claimed invented this history of cooking and sewing so that they could praise what the profession had supposedly become. By the beginning of the 1970s, home economics was increasingly under attack from feminists who argued that the profession promoted compulsory female domesticity. A statement protesting the EHEA, its leadership, and the exhibits at its convention condemned the way that, quote, the traditional roles of woman as housewife and consumer are being stressed. The most famous criticisms, however, came from Robyn Morgan, the editor of Sisterhood is Powerful. Morgan told the 1971 American Home Economics Association convention that the best way for home economists to improve women's lives was to, quote, quit their jobs, or at the very least to break down the notion that childcare and homemaking are gender jobs. Actually, home economists had been attempting to do that for decades. Articles in the Journal of Home Economics published in the early 1950s explained, for instance, that both the mother and father must realize the importance of their job as homemakers. A 1953 publication, Public Relations in Homemaking Education Depends on You, argued that teachers were responsible for proving that homemaking programs were important for boys as well as for girls. Nevertheless, Morgan's condemnation suggested the troubling ways in which outsiders viewed home economics. The AHEA Women's Roles Committee felt that some feminists had rejected them because home economics was so closely associated with homemaking. Our critics feel that home economics primarily teaches domesticity, and that the woman's role is in the home as wife and mother, and that anything else she does is secondary, observed one leading home economist. If home economics does indeed perpetuate this concept of women, we have some rethinking to do. Even before Robyn Morgan spoke at the AHEA convention, leading home economists were urging their peers to take a hard look at what we present to women as the central purpose of their life, child-rearing and childbearing, and instead prepare women for the inevitability that she cannot have the maternal role as her sole role in life. Morgan's comments accelerated these concerns. The Women's Roles Committee proposed and assisted in an analysis of 100 secondary home economics textbooks printed between 1964 and 1975. The study found many textbooks that seemed to conscientiously avoid sexist language or images, but there were also texts that used only female pronouns in reference to homemakers, or that would be, quote, impossible to use in classes that included male students. While Morgan opposed mandatory home economics for women, she believed that requiring it for men might encourage them to, quote, pull an equal share of childcare and homemaking. And home economists did encourage homemaking education for male students, though sometimes with different effects. Without home economics education, some argued, boys could become the harsh but weak and undependable fathers whose sons fill the jails. Some will be the husbands who are led by their gullibility to the bankruptcy courts. To attract boys, many programs in states like Arizona and Nebraska reinvented and renamed home economics as bachelor survival. This title, of course, suggests that only men without wives needed to learn about credit and supermarkets and clothing maintenance. Attracting boys to future homemakers of America evidently required similar measures. One Wyoming chapter advised that specialized content was key. Cooking techniques would be most interesting to male students if discussed in the context of backpacking trips. This suggests that multiple and gendered definitions of homemaker could exist, something home economists would attempt to change in the late 1970s. Accommodating males in FHA could also be difficult. A 1973 newsletter for chapter advisors warned that even advisors might believe that FHA was irrelevant for young men. One male member from Florida complained of attending FHA functions where speakers made comments like, "Thank you, young ladies, for coming here today," and "You young ladies look pretty in your dresses." Traditional functions like Daddy Date Night had to be renamed. Some male members reported harassment from other students who called them sissy and gay, and when a middle school in Connecticut required its male and female students to spend half the year studying home economics and the other half studying industrial arts, members of the local church protested that the course might promote male homosexuality. But despite these problems, efforts to expand the definition of homemakers to include males seem to be working. Approximately 153,000 males enrolled in high school home economics in the 1967-1968 school year. That number more than quadrupled in the 1972-1973 school year. FHA saw similar results. By the late 1960s, boys were serving as FHA chapter presidents. A single chapter in Yukon, Oklahoma reported 150 male members in 1977. The state of Texas claimed over 6,000 male members in 1978. While secondary educators worked to convince boys that they, too, could be homemakers, groups of home economists like the AHEA Research and Development Unit protested the ways that popular media normalized the, quote, one career, two persons family composed of a dull-witted female homemaker, married to a man with an 8-to-5 job. Robyn Morgan had accused home economists of preparing young women for a life of identifying themselves as, quote, just a homemaker, but actually home economists rejected the ways in which society belittled and ignored the contributions of homemaking and homemakers by portraying them as dull-witted. The AHEA argued that unwaged homemaking benefited individuals and improved the standard of living for an entire family. Furthermore, many home economists were troubled that American legal structures did so little to recognize the worth of homemaking and hoped to improve the situation through research that highlighted the production of goods and services by homemakers or even by individual family members. Home economists opposed laws that ignore the contributions of unwaged homemaking when assessing a housewife's property rights following death or divorce. Some home economists began participating in drafting and lobbying for state legislation that would provide full-time homemakers with credit for earnings, pensions, and other economic benefits that accrued during the marriage. Other home economists found themselves serving as expert witnesses in lawsuits involving the death or injury of a homemaker. Home economists also worked to assign actual monetary values on homemaking tasks, and some even advocated for recognition of homemaking in the gross national product. The AHEA was proud of its efforts to redefine homemaking and hoped to highlight them in a series of public service ads designed to, quote, build a new image for the association that would repair stereotypes about home economics. In the late 1970s, the AHEA produced an ad that ran with the headline, "My wife doesn't work, she stays at home with the kids." The image featured a woman balancing a toddler, a phone, and a pencil, and was carefully crafted, as one of its creators put it, to suggest mental work rather than drudgery. The copy accompanying the image, which was also used in radio announcements, offered a primary message that homemaking is work, and additionally explained that homemaking tasks could be done by any member of the family. The frequency with which this particular ad was requested suggests that the AHEA had hit a nerve. But even as home economists worked to strengthen the image of homemakers, a keynote speaker at the annual Home Economics Forum declared in 1977 the American homemaker was an endangered species. Blaming the women's movement for turning homemakers into, quote, losers and unwitting and unwilling victims, end quote, she challenged both feminists and home economists to consider the plight of the older homemaker. Legislation for displaced homemakers, women who'd worked for years as unpaid homemakers and then through divorce or death lost their incomes, their lifestyles, their vocations, became an official AHEA priority. The efforts of home economists on behalf of displaced homemakers offered revised understandings of homemaking that emphasized more than ever the economic vulnerability and the tentative social position of homemakers in the U.S. In an era of no-fault divorce and increased life expectancy for women, displaced homemakers often found themselves without spousal support, too young for Social Security, unlikely to remarry, and without the recent experience necessary to secure a paying job. For displaced homemaker activists, the broad strategic goal was recognition of homemaking as work, something home economists had been doing for decades. This was a difficult task because, as two writers in the Journal of Home Economics argued, homemaking was, quote, the invisible occupation. But more than just recognizing the ways that homemaking had been ignored, home economists' work with displaced homemakers re-envisioned the potential value of housewifery. Displaced homemakers learned to count, volunteer, and homemaking activities as marketable skills and put them on their resumes. Home economics had long been touted as training that could serve as well in the home as in the waged working world, and time spent developing skills in either would only strengthen abilities. Work with displaced homemakers suggested the possibility of homemaking as producing skills that, with additional training, could be applied in many fields. A wife who'd balanced the family checkbook might be retrained for waged work as a bookkeeper. A homemaker familiar with sewing patterns might use these skills as a basis for learning drafting. So while Home Economist had gone to great lengths in the early 1960s to explain that their training differentiated them from average homemakers and housewives, by the late 1970s, Home Economists found themselves arguing that practical skills learned at home could be the basis for wage jobs in fields that included home economics. In addition to working directly with displaced homemakers in developing skills and locating resources, Home Economists urged secondary teachers to develop curriculum that warned students about discriminatory laws against wives and that gave a realistic picture of women's financial position following divorce. And Future Homemakers of America increasingly did promote this as a model of womanhood. Sessions at national meetings frequently addressed, quote, the double-duty life and career planning for the future homemaker/wage earner. FHA members reported that they had an advantage, as dual responsibilities and dual income families became more visibly common because they already had an expanded image of the homemaker. Defining the homemaker became a central concern of the FHA by the late 1970s. The homemaker image is so important, one former Oregon State officer declared, because FHA's, quote, horizons cover more than the kitchen sink. Future homemakers also saw it as important to determining their own expectations as married adults. In this period, FHA's attempts to define the homemaker involved one or both of two basic assertions. The first simply declared that everyone is a homemaker, frequently illustrating this point by emphasizing the participation of men in homemaking activities. The second rejected stereotypical, traditional housewifery, an image that was often employed but rarely defined, and snubbed specific domestic tasks, particularly cooking and sewing. A PSA released by the FHA in the late 1970s labeled homemaking, quote, the most misunderstood profession because actually everyone was a homemaker, including single people, bachelors, working women, as well as wives, husbands, and children. The PSA urged readers to take a short quiz about running a household, including questions about wills, family rules, and grocery budgets, explaining that if you can't pass this simple test, you might flunk life. Homemaking knowledge, then, was crucial regardless of sex, age, occupation, or marital status. The Everyone is a Homemaker campaign proved very popular among FHA chapters. A Pennsylvania chapter created an exhibit of homemaker dolls that included a Raggedy Andy, a $6 million man, and a, quote, Puerto Rican fruit girl. FHA members were cautioned against printing news stories or taking photographs that singled out a male member as Mr. FHA because tactics could undermine the motto by implying that male future homemakers were a rarity. In the early 1980s, FHA sponsored the printing of Homemaking is Everybody's Business slogan on Safeway grocery bags across the country. Members in Nebraska ensured that the message would get to younger children by creating an Everyone is a Homemaker coloring book distributed to kindergarten and first grade students. Future homemakers who attended the 1984 National Conference could hear keynote speaker Anson Williams, best known for his portrayal of Warren Potsy Weber on the popular sitcom Happy Days, talk about how even he was a homemaker. Proposed AHEA public service announcements drafted in the late 1970s suggest that adult home economists were also on board with the message. One draft began with a photograph of a male homemaker scouring a kitchen floor under the headline, Man at Work. Using a similar tactic, an FHA chapter in Mississippi spoofed the popular television game show To Tell the Truth, asking a businessman, a career woman, and a third woman dressed, quote, as a traditional homemaker, to describe their reasons for being a homemaker. In the end, all three stood up, declaring themselves the real homemaker. While this Mississippi chapter included the traditional homemaker in its definition, other chapters were specific to explain that as future homemakers, they transcended this image. For instance, a 1979 Teen Times article affirmed that the homemaker was not, quote, uptight in apron strings and head over heels in waxy buildup. Another future homemaker explained that she was not a little homebody who cooks and sews all the time. Future homemakers were increasingly urged to prevent others from thinking of future homemakers as an organization primarily concerned with female domesticity. A 1978 FHA New York newsletter warned against stereotypes of FHA as, quote, girls who get together once in a while for the sole purpose of playing with pots, pans, and sewing machines. A public relations manual used in the 1980s told students to prevent photographers from taking in the kitchen shots, even when the project involved food preparation, because it could reinforce negative stereotypes about the organization. By rejecting girlish activities, advisors explained, they were simply defining homemaking in non-gendered terms. The existence of male homemakers was a regular theme in FHA efforts to define everyone as a homemaker. As one Ohio future homemaker bluntly explained, whether it's right or not, people think if guys are involved with an activity, it's serious. Indeed, the state of Wisconsin, for example, reported that enrollment in high school home economics was decreasing, but schools that attracted boys to the discipline found course enrollment steadying or even increasing. In a Teen Times article issued in 1978 with the title, "Thar's Dadburn Boys a Runnin' Round in Future Homemakers of America," FHA students could read that the mere presence of guys in FHA chapters would, quote, curl your lace curtain image of homemaking. Louise, the head kerchief and apron-wearing, drawling female cartoon who learned about the titular Dadburn Boys, was created by the Tennessee Association to start discussion about ways to encourage male membership. The image of the disapproving housewife, clearly older and marked as ignorant and unsophisticated by her speech and her dress, is engineered to make male FHA membership seem modern and mainstream by contrast. Home economists had long focused on convincing the public that the profession had advanced from the horse and buggy era to the jet and space capsule era, often accomplished by rejecting traditional, gendered understandings of housewifery in favor of, quote, the progressive, forward-looking side of home economics. Thus, members of FHA attempted to defy its gendered image in ways that actually reinforced certain negative stereotypes of female domesticity. Furthermore, when FHA or AHEA publications mentioned the presence of male future homemakers, they frequently did so in ways that underscored their masculine physiques or skills. One Michigan student hoping to expand the outdated image of homemaking was praised for, quote, the brawn he's developed working on his dad's farm and participating in a variety of high school sports. Two Texas FHA students were noted for being football stars and for their ability to cut the mustard in the kitchen as well as in the field. A public relations manual from the 1980s pointed out that Heisman Trophy winners Herschel Walker and Bo Jackson were both alumni. Even chapter projects involving men might focus on appeals to masculinity. After a survey of preschoolers' fathers revealed that many spent little time with their children, the chapter developed a program of 5 workshops titled Tough Guys, Tender Fathers to teach 35 male participants to learn about child development and ways to interact with their children. Similarly, a guidebook produced in 1975 to attract and teach boys in home economics classes urged teachers to find a way to, quote, enhance their masculine image and at the same time provide them with the opportunity to learn in the home economics department. The introduction of Crusher Lazowski might have challenged that. Some of you might have seen the picture of Crusher Lazowski in the announcement for this talk. Crusher, a burly, tattooed older man with a receding hairline, a ruffled apron, and a bowl of batter, first appeared in 1977 as part of a public service announcement released to over 4,000 news outlets by the national FHA staff. Crusher's popularity with future homemakers was immediate. Students bought t-shirts with Crusher's image and his tagline, when Crusher Lazowski talks about being a homemaker, you listen. The Nebraska Association created a soap opera that gave Crusher a career as a television wrestler, a brother Rocky, who's wary of Crusher's needlepoint and who thinks cookin's for sissies, and a prospective stepfather who disapproves of Crusher's dusting. Yet, despite their scorn, Crusher never questions performing these tasks. By episode 4, it becomes clear that Crusher's rejection of stereotypes about men's and women's work is inspired by his mother, who believes that she can deliver mail as well as any man. Crusher Lazowski might have been poised not only to broaden the image of the homemaker, but also to do so in ways that regarded traditionally female homemaking tasks in a positive light. When home economists were repeatedly explaining that they did not just stitch and stir, Crusher cooked, Crusher sewed, Crusher even cleaned. But instead, most future homemakers focused on his masculinity as an alternative, not an expansion, of traditional images of homemaking. As 2 male members put it, the Susie homemaker image is out and the Crusher Lazowski image is in. Their chapter used the Crusher Lazowski character in a skit to demonstrate how FHA and Hero were relevant to male students. In an AP article that ran in at least 50 newspapers, a national officer of FHA explained that Crusher made it okay for men to call themselves homemakers while still maintaining their masculinity. Quote, here's this big virile man who looks like a construction worker saying he's a homemaker. We like to feel that all our male members are little Crushers. Thus, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, home economists could regard the homemaker as both an endangered species, victimized by both law and society, and as universal according to the motto, everyone is a homemaker. Through the 1980s, though, both the homemaker and the home economist faced threats by forces that regarded both as anachronisms. Home economics was, as one home economist put it, in danger of extinction, with the president's budget explaining that cooking, sewing, upholstery, quilting, and other activities are not high priorities for federal funding. Furthermore, increased requirements for high school math, science, and foreign language seemed to threaten home economic enrollment, and a 1984 report found that home economics supervisors were increasingly worried about public relations and urged teachers to be more assertive in their attempts to sell themselves. Home economists continued, as they had for decades, to write letters and articles and testimony explaining that home economists did very little cooking and sewing and were concerned with professional training, not preparation for housewifery. But others worried the discipline was casting aside a job that many of its students found very important. One wrote to the Journal of Home Economics to explain that her career as a full-time homemaker was, quote, one of the most important jobs one can have, but it does need to be recognized as a worthy occupation. A home economics teacher reported in 1984 that she, quote, writhed inside when a brilliant young academician in home economics proudly announced, "My classes are not meant for Betty Homemaker, I'm educating professionals." She believed that this sort of thinking was as restrictive to women as obligatory homemaking. Why, especially when, quote, home economists are fighting for a place professionally, she wondered. Couldn't home economists respect full-time homemakers or femininity more generally? As one editor of Marketing Home Economics lamented in 1993, we have in home economics a devalued group of people, women, trying to strengthen a devalued entity, home and family, with devalued skills, child rearing and household work. In 1984, the AHEA's home economists and homemaking had declared that they proudly identify as homemakers, but already members of the group were campaigning to change its name, and in June of 1988, the Home Economists and Homemaking section voted to change its name to Home Economists in Home and Community, which some members felt better reflected their diverse experiences as retirees, homemakers, and people in transition. In 1977, when FHA could claim that approximately 20% of its membership was male, the organization's male president still found it necessary to defend his presence in the organization by reminding people that everyone is a homemaker. The problematic nature of the word homemaker had long fueled support for a name change by both students and teachers. In 1988, for instance, student officers in the Massachusetts Association circulated a petition signed by members in the North Atlantic region requesting a name change. They cited declines in membership and continued difficulty in attracting students, especially males, to an organization whose name is, quote, often misunderstood. Nearly a decade later, in 1997, high school teachers reported that, quote, once people hear future homemaker, the glaze goes over the eyes. At last, in 1999, FHA delegates voted to abandon the name Future Homemakers of America in favor of its current name, Family, Career, and Community Leaders of America. The name change reflected a thorny past of attempts to define and redefine the American homemaker and her or his relationship to the professional image of the home economist. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.